Thank you for inviting me to give this talk. This is the first time I've given a talk about this particular aspect of the A14 project. We're kind of still partway through the analysis stage, so everything that I'm going to say today is very provisional. And comments are very much welcome. Nothing here is set in stone at this point, and I'm sure there are a lot of comments that people will have, which will no doubt be incredibly helpful. So please shout up if you've got any ideas. The one thing that I do need to emphasize, I'm not going to have time to go into any depth about quite how we've done this, but I need to really ram home the point this is a collaborative project. Anybody who's heard about the A14 will understand that it's quite the beast to wrangle. So I've kind of tried to make it clear on this slide that this is very much a joint effort, in particular in relation to this part of the project. None of it would have been possible without the help of Alice Lyons and our very own Nico Hudak, with whom I share kind of equal credit for this aspect of things. I also want to acknowledge the role of Highways England in so generously funding the project. So just to get us started, for anybody who's not familiar with the project, this is kind of the broadest level at which I can display the A14 project. The southern black line is the line of the new road improvement. The northernmost black line is the old route of the road. If anybody knows this part of the world, you'll have known that before a few years ago, to a certain extent up until now with the roadworks, it's an absolute nightmare. So this project is not only a gift to motorists, it's also a gift to archaeologists. We've uncovered archaeology right the way through from the Mesolithic period to the post-medieval period. And you can see all of those little dots along the line of the road indicate substantial archaeology, which we have excavated. The scheme itself, kind of administratively speaking, is split up into, as Lana referred to yesterday, what we're calling targeted excavation areas, those TEAs, each of which effectively acts as kind of a discrete site along the route. And those in themselves are grouped into 8 what we're calling landscape blocks. So that's just kind of to make the whole scheme manageable from a post-ex point of view. I'm going to start off by kind of whizzing us through some of what I think are the most picturesque, I suppose, finds, sites in particular from the scheme. If you'll all indulge me briefly, a bit of prehistory to start us off. So this is on targeted excavation area 16, TA 16, which is just to the west of the River Great Ouse, to the south of the village of Brampton. The yellow feature in the middle is a Neolithic monument, and then the brown ring surrounding it is a Bronze Age barrow placed over the top of it. And then you can see there's lots of other kind of little dots. They're features associated with late Bronze Age into early Iron Age burials. So kind of a really nice example of the dense kind of archaeology that we've got, the good quality archaeology that we've got in this really quite interesting and yeah, just kind of fascinating prehistoric part of the landscape. Moving on in time to the late Iron Age, this is kind of one of my favourites, not least because I'm getting to analyse apart from this site. This is TA7. You can see the kind of hashed area which snakes its way through the landscape there. That's a set of paleo channels into which the Iron Age enclosures have been nestled. I mean, I just kind of think this, you can kind of almost feel this landscape, you know. You can kind of imagine someone walking around one of these enclosures, maybe tending to that cattle with the stream running by. You know, I like to think that it's kind of a nice idyllic little scene. This is also a very dense area of archaeology. The bits which we can't see on this plan are a Saxon settlement which overlies this one, and then on top of that is a deserted medieval village. So again, very dense archaeology, very complex. And then moving on again through time, this is TA20, which is predominantly late Roman in date. We're looking at here probably the outskirts of a Roman villa estate. For a little bit of context, this is immediately to the east of the River Great Ouse, so kind of immediately opposite the barrow, which I just showed you. Unfortunately, and rather annoyingly, we missed the villa itself, we think, which is kind of in that bit of the unexcavated area of the trench. So that's a little bit frustrating, but we've got loads of good stuff from the site. I think Alice is currently working through this stuff at the moment. As I say, predominantly like Roman assemblage, but lots of nice CBM as well, box flue tiles, that sort of stuff, which indicate relatively high status occupation. But what we're really interested in today is evidence for an almost, and I emphasize the point, almost entirely new pottery industry, comprising 43 early Roman kilns found on the A14 alone. These occupying 7 distinct spatial groups, which I've kind of roughly marked out with the red diamonds, which you can see on the map there. There is also one additional site which we add to this industry, which contributes an extra 8 kilns. RAF Brampton, that's the blue diamond. This was excavated in, I think, 2015 by Oxford Archaeology East and published again by our very own Alice Lyons. The A14 excavations produced around 100 kilos of production waste from our kilns, so a considerable amount of material to study. And the key point to this is that all of these kilns, as well as those from RAF Brampton, seem to have been producing broadly similar greyware pottery. So that is the kind of big takeaway point that we got from the assessment, that this seems to have been a unified industry, and you can kind of see the density with which they occupy the landscape just where we've cut through it with the A14 transect. You can kind of imagine that actually a lot more of these things probably existed in the gap, at least between us and the RAF Brampton kilns, potentially elsewhere in the region as well. So it's a very, very significant find. We've been put in the kind of, I think, unusual position where we had to name this industry. I get the impression from kind of other industries that these names sort of develop organically over time in a lot of cases. We had to actually sit down and decide what we were going to call it one day. It was weird. But basically, we were going to originally call it the Brampton industry, but there is already one of those. We also decided we want to kind of name it after a topographic feature rather than a modern feature. So we called it the Lower Ouse Valley industry, and all of our pottery codes henceforth have been termed along those lines. And a quick note just to say that we've also got possible late Iron Age pottery kilns as well. The evidence from the Iron Age kilns is relatively ephemeral, particularly in relation to the Roman ones. But we've got what looks like a production group from at least one kiln, so it kind of looks like there's a bit of a late Iron Age background here as well. Speaking of the late Iron Age background, southern Cambridgeshire is one of the few places in the country where we've actually got quite a lot of evidence now, relatively speaking, for pottery production emerging from the late Iron Age precedent, by which I mean kiln sites producing wares probably dated to around the context period, i.e. pre-Flavian period, but which were being made in Iron Age styles, so predominantly the Alsford Swalling style. One of the best examples of this is Greenhouse Farm, which I've furnished illustrations from here, but there are others, Adam Brooks in Cambridge, Blackwell's Road, Swavesey, etc. The kilns that they were using to make pottery seem to have been predominantly derived from the kind of classic late Le 10 types, so they're the simple kind of shallow scoops in the ground with a dragged out kind of stoking area. As you can see illustrated there, there's some unusual ones a little bit, like the double flued example we've got at the top there, with these kind of weird elongated integral pedestals, and the integral pilasters as well. You can kind of see just, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but there's these kind of little features on the sides of the kilns which look like they're probably props for the kiln bars rather than having a shelf that went all the way around. So just kind of make a mental note of that, because we'll come back to that sort of thing in a minute. And just to say how they're kind of arranged in relation to the sites that they're found on. This tends to be a theme with these sites, as far as I can see, that they are kind of scattered fairly haphazardly across the sites on which they're found, and in fairly close association to the enclosure systems in which they're found. So for instance, at Greenhouse Farms we've got here, you can see there's several groups of kilns, some of which seem to respect ditches, but others of which are just kind of dotted within the enclosure. I'm not sure if they found any direct evidence of actual domestic settlement in this enclosure, But if that is the case, then it just kind of ramps home the point that they're actually in quite close proximity to a settlement area. But then the next generation of pottery production is kind of represented by our new Lower Ouse Valley industry. So as I say, the kilns that we've got at Greenhouse Farm and the other sites in southern Cambridgeshire in the pre-flavouring period seem to date probably at most to about 30 years before the Lower Ouse Valley industry gets going. So it almost is the next generation of people who are doing, who have this far more intense industry. The kiln waste that we've found has been dominated in large part by these lid-seated jars. They're a little bit of a departure from what they were producing in the Alsford tradition in those pre-flavouring kilns. They're in a nice hard greyware. I showed them to a modern art potter, and he commented on how well made they are. Very thin-walled in a lot of cases, very finely made. The lid-seated jars, while it's a greyware fabric, and there might be some difficulty in recognising the fabric amongst kind of a mass of greywares, the forms are fairly distinctive. Some of the lid-seated jars have a little bit of carination on the shoulder. They've got these rilling marks in a lot of cases, and the rim is just this kind of small outturned area with just, in some cases, a little divot in the top of the rim to create the lid seating rather than the kind of big cupped rims that you find on a lot of these forms. We do sometimes find the lids, as is kind of standard for the region. The lids aren't anywhere near as common as the lid-seated jars themselves, so that's kind of a conundrum that we've been wrestling with for years. Hypothetically, a lot of the lids were made in organic materials, so wood and such, but clearly that doesn't survive. We do find them occasionally in ceramic, but it's not the rule. The other major component of the assemblage is neck jars, some of which are carinated. We've also got these unusual, kind of typologically quite weird versions of the neck jars, which are the ones on the right of the slide. They've got these kind of odd triangular rims and little stab bits on the shoulders. We originally thought actually that some of these were going to be medieval, but we showed them to the medieval specialists and they didn't like them either. They're from secure Roman context, so it would have been weird if that was the case. But yeah, they're just a bit of an oddity. They've been found on very few sites locally. I've seen one elsewhere, which I'm sure is identical to these, but that's it. I think they are a little bit of an oddity. And then the final main component of the output seems to have been these Cam 30 derived dishes with burnished patterns sometimes on the interior. So basically we're looking at an assemblage with kind of the typical three main forms. It's that sort of thing, it's a fairly complete repertoire in terms of function. You've got a jar, you've got a coarse jar, a neck jar, and a serving vessel. Some other major major in terms of their interpretation vessel types, which are not as common as those, are the beaded rim dish, which looks like it's probably derived from black burnished ware prototypes, so that kind of pushes our dates a little bit into the 2nd century. For some of the kilns at least, again, they're not common, so I think that's probably just a later component of the industry. And butt beakers, again, small quantities of these, but the dating of these is important for establishing the date of the industry, and also importantly, the very early Roman dates of these vessels is backed up by several radiocarbon determinations that we've got from the kilns as well. So we're looking at a start date for the industry of around AD 60 to 70, so very early, and particularly for such intense activity. The kilns themselves, yeah, so a lot of them are really, really nicely preserved, and have a lot of the pedestals, which are actually portable pedestals, left in situ. So you can see there's several examples here. Unusually, we don't have many kiln bars from these kilns. This was something they also encountered at RF Brampton. You got several pedestals, but no bars to go along with them. Now, I'm sure that we would have needed bars in order to make these a working kiln. I don't think really they would have wanted to just stack pots on top of these things. Kind of looking at pictures of these kilns when they were unexcavated, I thought that maybe that was what was going on, but it just kind of doesn't look like a stable arrangement. So you would have needed some bars, but we don't really have many of them. That's a little bit unusual. But yeah, again, kind of coming on, there is a little bit of an unusual. This is a bit of an unusual feature to the industry. The kind of reliance, the almost overkill nature of the pedestals, and it's something which seems to be a bit of a feature of local industries. I know that Horningsea kilns, for instance, which are kind of developing around the same time, also have kind of an unusual arrangement within their kilns. They rely on the pilasters on the edges of the kilns themselves to prop bars onto, but again, bars themselves not being common finds from within them. So whatever's happening to those bars, they're going elsewhere and we're not finding them. This is one of the sites on which we found these kilns. So just to put you in the picture, running up the left-hand side here, these features are our kilns on this site. So this the southern part of TA11 going into the northern part of TA12. You can see it's related very strongly to this trapezoidal enclosure system. We've looked at the phasing again. This plan is a tiny bit out of date. We probably think that a lot of this enclosure system is also contemporary with the kilns at this point. So there's a little bit of editing to go on here. But yeah, so just to put this into a bit of context, also, I think that probably that arrangement of kilns is respecting a bit of ditch that we're missing in TA11. You can kind of see the return of this ditch in TA12, and it's either been truncated or it's been missed in TA11. But basically, the kilns seem to be on the very outskirts of this settlement, which to me sort of suggests, unlike the greenhouse farm examples where we've just got kind of haphazard scattering of kilns across an enclosure, potentially with occupation associated with it, here they're very much going, that's a kind of outside activity, it's very much an outside activity area. Slightly different situation in the northern part of TA11 where there are again more kilns. The red dots here show you where different kilns are. Again, this is a bit more of a haphazard arrangement, but there's no associated settlement with it. There's a trackway that's going somewhere, but it seems that if there is a nearby settlement, we're very much on the edge of it. The interesting thing about this part of the site is that everything that we've got here looks, the industry seems to be the main feature that we're taking away from this. I.e., there doesn't seem to be much evidence of other activity. In particular, we're wondering whether the enclosure, that enclosure 204, which has some internal features in it, maybe had some kind of structure in there, maybe a temporary structure, which potters used to kind of set up a temporary workshop or working area. We've got the water hole in the bottom part of the site, which again, you need lots of water for potting, so it makes sense that they would have put things there. And also, you probably have a little bit of difficulty seeing this, but I've circled them there. There's these three structures, post-built structures, which you could easily allocate a role in relation to agriculture, but it could easily be that these were kind of platforms on which, covered platforms, I would thought, on which you would stack pots if you wanted them to dry. It's very, we all know that summer isn't exactly ideal in Britain. Maybe you want to elevate your pots off the ground in order to make sure that they've got good room to dry and make sure the air's circulating around them, etc. So yeah, just some thoughts about that. And then kind of a similar situation in TA16. Again, we haven't got all of this settlement. Very much the outline part of the settlement, so it kind of fits with the interpretation that potters were setting up shop on the edge of settlements, if indeed they were nearby. The scale of this map is very different, so clearly this is a far more dense arrangement of kilns. You can see the four in a line there. Yeah, so just to kind of illustrate, it seems to be a similar situation there as to elsewhere, with the activity very much being on the edge of where the settlement was nearby. Yeah, so these are one of the main types of kiln furniture which we've got here. I just want to mention these quickly. I'm aware of the time ticking on. These are circular kiln plates. They are found in other contemporary industries, most notably nearby Horningsea had a lot of them. We find them in the Upper Nene Valley as well. The interesting thing about them, other than their function, which has very much been only hypothesized upon, if anybody's got any ideas about what they might have been used for, I'd be very, very glad to hear about that. But the main thing that I want to pay attention to here is that they seem to have been made by pressing wet clay onto some kind of chaff, because you've got a flat surface underneath which was a surface with far more impressions in it, far more organic impressions in it. So it seems to be that they've kind of used a chaff as like a moulding sand for a tile, you know, stop it sticking to a working area. We've had some preliminary analysis done by one of our botanists on these, and she's come back to me and said it looks like a lot of these impressions are from oats, which she thought was a little bit unusual, given that oats are not a common feature of the botanical assemblages from the A14 sites in general. So she is wondering whether these are wild oats, not actual cultivars, but things which probably potters just kind of cut down from a nearby outcrop of this sort of plant, chop them up and then use them for their purposes. I think the thing that's interesting there is that it may indicate a bit of a disconnect between the potters and the agricultural communities who theoretically they would have been closely linked to. There's this whole debate in this region about there being potter farmers and whether potters were kind of part-time agriculturalists. This may suggest otherwise, kind of just very loosely, because, you know, clearly, ordinarily I would assume that you would use anything that you've got agriculturally in terms of waste and then use that for your purposes if that is readily available, but they're going elsewhere and finding a raw source of these raw materials. Of course, the counter argument to that, I suppose, is that seasonality, you know, potentially if you're doing this in the summer, before the harvest, there's not as much of that waste product around. Thoughts very welcome on that. They're a little bit of a mystery at the moment and more work needs to be done. And just to quickly summarise, I'm aware of time. So the Lower Ouse Valley industry is a very large, very intense, but fairly short-lived early Roman industry. So the dates that we've put on it when we're giving numbers to it are about AD 60 to 130 or 150, just to account for all the variation of forms that we've got from the different kilns. We're kind of working on the basis that maybe pottery making would have been supplementary to a predominantly agricultural local economy, though we need to do a bit more thinking and a bit more work to kind of clarify some of those relationships. And as I've discussed, the kiln plates and the relationships of the kilns to their wider settlement pattern is a key part of that. But a really important aspect that I've been thinking about a lot over the last year or two is this industry as part of a Flavian kind of industrial boom. This is an idea that I think Jerry Evans put forward in relation to Horningsea, that in this area you get relatively lots of evidence for pre-Flavian courseware production, and then it's only when you get to the 60s or 70s AD that they start to produce greywares, whereas they're produced a lot earlier in other parts of the country, as we all know. And this is kind of an interesting theory, you know, and it's something that is mirrored in the Huntingdon Valley as well. So there's kind of this swathe of central England where we've got this kind of chronological pattern. I think there's got this, I just asked kind of fairly big questions about what the nature of this period of technological change was in the context of Roman Britain, you know, and specifically what was the kind of, how was the economy developing in this period? Can we relate this to things like the development of towns, maybe the role of the military? I'm aware that this is kind of around the time that we would have thought around the time of the Boudiccan invasion, so perhaps there's something going on there. The Boudiccan invasion, the Boudiccan revolt, so maybe there's something going on there. But also, you know, in the context of us having this greater understanding now of rural archaeology, particularly rural synthesis at the moment in the aftermath of the Roman Rural Settlement Project, can we start to think about this as a component of how rural industries developed, and, you know, try and get a bit more of a handle on how local economies were working in this period and what local rural responses were to the Roman invasion and the economic aftermath of that. Anyway, that's kind of where we are at the moment, and I'll leave it there. Thank you for your attention.